He can speak on a number of topics. Do I have to stay silent?
And you're aware that that's your camera, if you want to look at somebody.
The middle one?
This one here.
Yeah, there.
Hey, morning all. Welcome to the first episode of the Orrock Podcast. I've got with me this morning Dr. Arno van Niekerk, a professor, I believe, at the University of the Free State and also author of the book Inclusive Economics. Dr. Arno, thank you for coming on this morning, man.
Thank you, Orrock. Wonderful to be with you.
I had a read of your book this weekend, and it was quite an inspiration. But before we begin there, Arno, maybe just a bit of background on yourself. You're from Bloemfontein.
Yeah.
Grew up on a farm, grew up in the town. What's sort of your background as a South African?
Yeah, so I'm actually, I grew up in the Karoo.
Yeah.
We had a farm between Hopetown and Prieska.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm absolutely a Karoo boykie. Love the platteland and the rural areas. So I was at school in Hopetown, matriculated there, and yes, had an incredible time. I am very thankful about that background because it grounds you,
Yeah.
Actually came to play rugby at the University of the Free State.
Yeah.
Very much into sports. I was actually
Position lock?
Sport Mac. No, eighth man.
Oh, eighth man.
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but played tennis for the varsity, Shamlas, and late into the Free State under 20s groups and so on. But passionate about just starting life and starting new things, and then obviously into the studies as well. And from there it basically
Why
proceeded.
economics?
So it's a good question. My grandfather was the accountant in Hopetown for many years.
Okay.
He had the practice there, doing all the farmers' books and everybody, and he really wanted me to take over the practice. So he always suggested push for accounting. But I was never sure that's the thing.
Sure.
I enjoyed economics. You wouldn't believe it. I actually wanted to study when I was at school, those days, standard 7, standard 8, architecture, because
Gotcha.
I love drawing and I love design and all of that stuff.
So it wasn't sort of like this calling as such.
That's right, yeah.
You had various interests and you sort of found yourself.
Yeah, I would say I grew into it. Actually, so I always took these accounting subjects with the economics and the banking subjects. And at some stage, my grandfather had to decide whether to proceed with the practice. So he said, well, just try do your articles at an accounting firm and see. And when I was there, I realized, no, it's too boxed in. I need to be operating with a bit more space, and then the varsity offered me a position, and to also I finished my master's degree, and I could do they offered me a position and an option to do my PhD. So
I'm sure you could have been offered some pretty awesome, well-paying corporate jobs.
Yeah, it was something I was considering, of course. When you are finishing your studies, I did my master's in money and banking, my honors in investment management. So it's really the world is so open for you in terms of the investment world and the banking and so on. But I actually the whole opportunity to do my PhD drew me a lot because I could, like do research on what my passion is, and eventually it ended up, and that's maybe an interesting topic, doing big part of my research at the World Bank and the IMF in Washington.
That's amazing, huh? How long did you spend there?
Yeah, I spent there, I think at least 6 months, between 6 months and a year. So a lot of the economists I met there, you know, and worked a little bit with them. They've got these think tanks. And I always say, when you're there, you're right in the internal mechanics of how the world economy operates.
That's fascinating.
Almost like the belly of the beast. You know, there you see how things are being done, and the whole vision for developed countries. And it's very interesting.
That's fascinating. And obviously, you don't just do lecturing at the University of the Free State. When I first made contact with you, you had come back from Taiwan.
Actually, from Austria.
From Austria.
That's right. So I was also lecturing there at a university in Salzburg, so it's an annual thing. So I often lecture there, and then whenever the opportunity comes, one's involved in a little bit of consulting. I love the academic world, and doing research, and number of interesting people you meet along the way.
Would you say that the time that you've spent abroad in the IMF, like you call it, the belly of the beast, would you say that was sort of the initial steps to the inspiration of your book, The Inclusive Economy, sort of where you got to view how bad, or say how hectic, I'm not sure what word to put to that. It is.
No, it's a very good observation, because I think once I was there, I mean, that's the Washington, the heart of capitalism, you know, where the whole system is almost anchored there in London, you might argue. It's almost there where I saw that capitalism in its current state is not the solution, because of the inequalities that it generates. And for the third world countries to actually catch up with first world countries is almost impossible. We are drowning in debt, and then you've got this whole technological gap between the speed of innovation in the first world, and we are taking all the spillover. It's almost like a lose-lose situation, and the kind of capitalism we have, and that's a concern, and it's something I address in the book, and why I propose the changes, is that it's unsustainable. We are consuming more resources than what we are replacing. So it's not a long-term solution. But then, on the other hand, capitalism is probably the best system we've come up with so far, which leaves a lot of questions about what next.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you grew up in a Western capitalist system and apply any thought process to it, or do any reading, I mean, the system itself's been in a decline since 1996, right?
Yeah, actually,
America. The US prints money to sustain a system in decline, and without that printing of that capital, we would be.
It's a.
I mean, the system is broken, as you mentioned, right?
That's right.
It's broken. It can't be fixed. Nobody knows how to fix this.
That's the heart of the problem. In the US case, of course, and nowadays we hear a lot about this, the petrodollars and the demand for dollars, that kind of allowed them to keep on printing and not incur too much inflation. Probably we're going to speak about the whole shift in modern times, but at that stage, the globalization was a big thing, especially after the Cold War, early 1990s, and the whole U.S. Almost control of many industries around the world expanded, but also did the U.S. debt levels. It kind of exploded. So the system, I mean, and the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008 actually showed how this is what is called the bubble economy. It's inflated. Values of asset prices are inflated, not just physical, but also financial assets. And these, and it's all backed up by debt and not gold and silver. So that tells you at some point, the crisis will explode. And I mean, that happened development during that time, but we all realize that it's a system that doesn't have the substance that it's supposed to have. It overpromises and underdelivers.
And that's obviously not sort of good news for us in the developing world, and hasn't been for a very long time.
Yeah, especially us in Africa, because we've become so dependent on the first world countries, in terms of sustaining and also assisting with our development assistance, and also in terms of being able to borrow money. So, we have become more and more dependent on countries that are integral to the system, which is a worry for Africa, and it has not led to the economic growth or economic development, especially that it should have. It's a very troublesome situation, and that's probably a reason why we are looking to the East to kind of be the next savior. But that in itself, asks new questions.
I have an interesting question attached to that. It seems that when you go through the economic history of South Africa, you started with the Dutch, sort of the colonizing force, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, it then went to the English, and then we went into the apartheid sort of government. I'm skipping a lot, but we went into the apartheid government, and that put us into another economical dilemma. The point I'm trying to make is, and now into the ANC, is that as South Africans, we always seem to be dependent on somebody. Yet, we have the resources, we have the skills, we have the minerals, we have the agriculture, we have the oceans, we have the tech ability. Only the outside world makes us believe we don't. Why have we been so dependent for such a long time? I mean, surely it should have been obvious already in the 1950s that this dependency was just not really a good idea. Or is it because we have been so politically conflicted that has sort of snuck up on us, and that we have not been a manufacturing country?
It's a very good question. I think, of course, we went into independence in the 1960s, most African countries, and the immediate expectation was that our economies would grow, we would become self-sustainable, we have the resources, but it's almost as if, on the one hand, there's a skills shortage.
So if I can just interrupt, you mentioned the word in your book, it's called spiritual poverty.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that my question has anything related to that? If I can just cut to the chase.
I actually want to zoom in on that,
that because we don't believe that we actually have the ability.
That's right.
Yep.
It's and few economists would say this. We base our assumptions on facts, and that's right and correct. But apart from poverty as a quantitative reality, there's also something called the poverty spirit. Nowadays you see it. People win X amount of millions with lottos and all kinds of things, and a couple of months later they've got nothing again. So in other words, it's almost like a vicious cycle. And Africa has been trapped in this vicious cycle before independence, after independence, and it has not been able to get out of it. And then you've got the whole corruption issue and as you say, the political infighting and all of this. So we have constantly placed ourselves at a disadvantage, which means that we are in different ways being taken advantage of and becoming dependent on the rest of the world, because we are focused on quick, easy money. We don't want to, take resources, develop it from primary to secondary and tertiary products. We want to sell it as quickly as we can. And, while we had more resources earlier, it seemed like not a bad idea. But nowadays, especially now that technology becomes the game changer, we are literally seemingly out of the game.
If I can just touch on China quickly, and I want to touch on that after we go into your book in more detail, but I think it's relevant a little bit to this history. I naively, and I think many South Africans naively believe that our relationship with China began with the South African Communist Party and the ANC. And I was actually quite blown away that when you do a little bit more research on that, it began primarily with the British colonization of both South Africa and China, right? And
that's right.
That's sort of how that relationship began. And our relationship with them was basically spearheaded through London. We sort of chatted through London, and then London spoke to the Chinese for us, and that's sort of how that worked, right? And then we took the step ahead and then became apartheid, and then the West sort of denounced us. And we needed trading partners. And then the likes of Pik Botha go to China and they set up these relationships. And these relationships aren't only economic, they are military based. I mean, we're doing nuclear deals with the Chinese under the nationalist government, which is quite mind-blowing. And then sort of really changed my perspective of the complexity of South Africa's relationship with China, right? And then sort of then to understand too that, sorry, to jump previous to that, in the 1900s we brought in Chinese labor. And then in 1905, Smuts tried to repatriate the Chinese, and the ones that remained formed Chinatown in Johannesburg, which then was the biggest Chinese population on the African continent for a very long time, right? And then under the nationalist government, we were actually bigger investors into China than China was into South Africa, which is really hard to imagine, right? And then the ANC comes to power. Nelson Mandela decides that we do not support Taiwan's independence. We're going wholeheartedly with China. Then there's these progressive steps, right? So the Pretoria Declaration, the Beijing Declaration, and then it seems that Jacob Zuma gets really, really excited, or the Chinese get really excited when he comes to power, and a whole bunch of nonsense happens that we all know about. Don't really want to go into detail. The point I'm trying to make is our relationship with China is almost 140, 150 years old. It's not something that began yesterday or with the freedom struggle in the ANC movement. I mean, is that a correct
assessment? Absolutely. And it's, as you say, it's very complex and different interests meeting with China. And I mean, China has had different regimes as well. So over history,
because at that time it was the Republic of China, and then they went through their own revolution.
Exactly.
And we actually had closer ties with Russia, but they had an ideological dispute.
That's right. Yes.
Right. And then that's how we sort of then got back involved with the Chinese through the ANC again, right?
That's right. Yes. And I mean, if you look at it economically, trade between China and Africa was about, in the 1980s, about $1 billion. In the 1990s, it jumped to $10 billion. In the 2000s, $100 billion, and now it's hundreds of billion. I mean,
now we don't know.
Now, I mean, their investment in the telecommunications sector is almost $100 billion in itself. In Africa. So, it's almost as if, as the changes happened in China, so we realigned with China, but there was always this connection. And China is almost like also in the background, and has been throughout history this background role player in Africa, and still is somewhat today, in the sense that not everybody wants to talk about China. I mean, when I arrived back from Austria, the first magazine that I picked up at the Tambo airport was the title was China Africa, and how African leaders are so welcoming and intrigued with, what the Chinese is bringing to the table. I was shocked, because if we don't, it's as if our leaders don't really realize what they are playing with, what they are dealing with. China is not here to do some trading. They want to take control.
Exactly.
Especially if you look at the strength of their socialist initiative, corporate wise, and then also government in terms of the Communist Party.
We have the biggest cultural public relations offices, the most amount of them on the African continent in South Africa.
That's right.
There's a social propaganda construct. I wouldn't say propaganda, but there's a social plan at play. It's not just an economic plan.
So the economic plan, in a way, is feeding the social agenda, or let's say the political agenda that China has. And also, there's three. The political agenda, it's feeding the military agenda, and it's also feeding the security agenda. Because China needs to be able to control or to trust Africa. I mean, many of the African parliaments buildings have been built by the Chinese, and I saw in the news some time ago that they found some speakers underneath the tables.
There was thousands of them.
Exactly.
And there was a main line, a fiber optic line to Beijing from the African Union Parliament building.
That's right.
And it's actually quite embarrassing.
Very.
Yeah.
And I mean, with their technology and AI and all this
and just
stuff.
By the way, they supplied all the software and the servers and everything else, and the African Union didn't find that suspicious in any way or form.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's this blindness of African leaders that's a real concern. And also... we'll delve into that, but just to mention with the BRICS, it's almost as if we don't realize that we are trying to play to the West and the East, and we find ourselves in the middle. And the outcome of this is we can only be worse off in both cases.
Absolutely.
So, it's not the wisest thing to do. So we don't learn from history, and that's my whole point in our Chinese-Africa relationships and South Africa-Chinese. And that's the thing. We need to learn from history. We need to know that, they are not the ones that's going to bargain just for our benefit. They are in it for themselves. They, when you say with Taiwan, they had Africa supporting China, and that's how China got a seat in the United Nations.
Absolutely.
At the expense of Taiwan, and now with the Pretoria Beijing Declaration, we are fully aligned with China.
Absolutely.
And now China is on the brink of taking over Taiwan, which brings up serious tensions for the US and the rest of the world. And here we find ourselves in the middle, blind again to the massive realities of what's at stake.
I'd like to just backtrack a bit again, and I often find in South Africa that we sort of centralize our focus on the current corrupt government, which is obviously a huge issue. I mean, without a doubt, right? But when you have companies like Naspers, who have 46% ownership in companies like Tencent, which are one of the biggest media houses in the world, Chinese owned, right? And Naspers has got a history of I hate to say the word, but it has a rather apartheid background. It's was a very Afrikaans, Broederbond centralized sort of industry that is now with the Chinese. And then you have Standard Bank selling out X amount of shares to the Chinese. You've got MTN and Huawei. The list just goes on. And then the mining and the mineral side, that's just a whole different conversation altogether.
Absolutely.
And then on the coal and Eskom side, they basically own Eskom.
Yeah.
The reason, as I can see it, we're having load shedding is because China's owns Eskom and they're getting our coal. It seems to me quite simple. The point I guess I'm trying to make is, and I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's a well-known fact that before 1994 there was a meeting between capital heads of South Africa at the time and members of the Liberation Movement and the ANC, and these agreements, which Julius Malema has been screaming about forever, it's probably the only thing I agree with him on, is the publication of those conversations. Do you believe that every South African was sold out despite his culture, and the fact that we having racial issues in the country has got nothing to do with the reality of the economics of the country, and more that division is being sired by those who want that division, or am I being way too
extreme? I wouldn't say it's way too extreme, but it's something you can't ignore. There is a reality prior to 1994 of where agreements were signed, and it's all about economic interests. It was all about, securing certain things that is to our benefit, but not realizing that, the commitments and the things, it entangles us into things we are unable to deliver on. So I wouldn't say, the whole division and the cultural tension and the racial issues, is really a result of that. I think it's something that is being played maybe by external parties. I mean, there's even the George Soroses of this world, and influences in the West and also other parts of the world.
I mean, China's been paying for the ANC's political campaign since Nelson Mandela.
That's right. Yeah. So the vested interests, that's what entangles us. So behind the scenes, and I mean, we don't even need to speculate about it. It's already in the headlines. There's a lot of influences. I think the current situation with the ANC, almost like imploding, is causing serious stress for the Chinese and also for the rest of the those linked to the ANC, because if they are not in power, it kind of strips the highway they've got into Africa. So I think it's almost as if one don't want to be so blunt, because there's more complexity, but it's almost as if evil is exposed.
Absolutely,
in a sense, because there's a corruption background, not just on our side, but also on the Chinese, and all kinds of influences, all kinds of below the table deals, all kinds of issues that we've been hearing a lot. So maybe the time for exposing evil has come, and we need the truth, and for Africa to come into its own, and that's why I wrote the book as well, for Africa to come into its own and to fulfill its own destiny.
What I find quite interesting about the role that the ANC played with China, especially initially, China seems to have used the ANC as the negotiating road up into Africa. And as an ordinary South African, maybe I'm just naive, I've been sort of led to believe that the Chinese are in Zambia and the Chinese are in Tanzania, and that's where they're taking the harbors, and that's where all of these things are taking place. But to bring that around to the fact that we started that, right? So one of China's negotiating rules with us in the beginning was, well, we'll trade with you, but you need to go and open up Africa for us as such, right? And they banked on the ANC and its freedom credentials in order to achieve.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is, the ANC, because of the financial benefits, the ANC had vested interests themselves throughout the pre-94 years up in Africa. And that was being financed by Russia and by, China. So these interests were already established. Now they just needed to become more in favor of the Chinese to open up more opportunities to build the infrastructure and all of that. So I think, as you rightly say, to a large extent, the ANC has been this ball being played in the bigger scheme of things, which is a concern. And the big thing is they are unable to detach themselves or become independent again, or they are so wrapped up in this that it's almost as if the only way to kind of break the dependency we have on China is for the ANC almost to collapse.
Get off power. But it's a fine line that China's playing, right, with the ANC, right? I mean, I wonder if China kind of accepted the extent of the ANC corruption, because the corruption is kind of the Chinese Achilles heel, right? Because the corruption turns the population dramatically against the ANC. The Chinese need the ANC to stay in power, but the ordinary South African is getting more and more irritated. And the chances of social upheaval are becoming greater and greater and greater, as we saw in KZN a few years back and in Gauteng. I mean, the fact that that hasn't happened again is incredibly surprising. And if you take into account the world economic situation with inflation rates going up, people not being able to afford the basics, right, and poverty getting greater and greater, the only thing that's really keeping the ANC in power right now is a social grant. I mean, the way I see it, I mean, literally the only thing doing that, and the person funding the grant is probably the Chinese, right? So the welfare state it's a very fine line the Chinese are playing. I mean, they're playing with fire.
We've actually gone, I mean, with more than 50% of the population living on social grants, we've gone from a welfare state to almost like a socialist state, where it's fully dependent on government, majority of the people.
That suits the Chinese again,
That suits the Chinese. So I don't know, it's almost as if there's a race happening. This is my my own observation. It's almost as if the Chinese are seeing the collapse of the ANC due to corruption, as you rightly say, it's the very corruption that the ANC has and is being fed maybe by the Chinese that causes the collapse. But there's almost like a race to, before this collapse fully takes place, to have like a socialist state being established, which plays right perfectly into the hands of the Chinese. So it's either that or the ANC collapses and a completely new form of governance come into power, not just party but a governance system, and then that will be the last thing that Chinese would want. So I think the Chinese know there are change coming, so they're trying to push as far as they can with the ANC. But evil can't survive. It will be exposed at some point. So for me, it's almost like, there must be this higher purpose to South Africa and even Africa, that now in these times that we're seeing a major agenda being pushed by the Chinese and even the Russians and many others in Africa, Iran as well. Suddenly those the power structures that they depended on are collapsing. And I think from a people's perspective, and this is really just an observation, we are actually hoping that the sooner the better, so that we can build on new foundations, so that we can have systemic change. And that's also part of why I wrote the book. Milton Friedman was the one who said that when there's a crisis, it's the opportunity to prepare the new system, what needs to be changed. Then the politically impossible will become the politically inevitable.
Gotcha.
And I think that's where we are aiming at. From a people's perspective, but from a government perspective and the Chinese, it's almost the opposite. So I think there's hope for change, but it's going to be interesting to see.
The question I wanted to go to is, when you said that the Chinese are aware that we're in a rush, right? And I know this is not your speciality or your level of expertise or anything, but I mean, perhaps just an assumption. Sort of an enforcement, as in a subtle, here we are, sort of move, or is that more toward the West and less to do with us? Am I thinking that we're more important than what we actually are? But I mean, it's very odd, right? That we have.
Listen, as you say, it's not my field expertise, but my question is more, what does it signal? When Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, we had the Chinese having some, military exercises in that direction. Now that you've got the Ukraine war with Russia and the tensions and the whole focus of replacing the dollar as a reserve currency, suddenly, and there's talk about expanding BRICS and all of that. Now you've got these military exercises in South Africa, and it's interesting, the US was very quick to respond to that, making some visits to South Africa. So I think it's almost as if the Chinese and maybe the Russians are luring us into signaling with them the intention of the East. And I think it's the unwisest thing we can do.
Absolutely.
Especially if we say we want to be that bridge building, function. I mean, we heard that with the Israel Palestinians, and the government rather want to, now we are almost allowing choosing sides. So no, I think it plays into their hands. It's definitely not in our hands, our interest. But I think, the moment you realize that the government, I think they don't have much options in terms of how tied they are, which actually, yes, it's signaling to the rest of the world, but it's I think it's the people that must see the signal the best, the people of South Africa, and realize, listen, we need a change as quickly as possible so that we can realign this nation and Africa.
Two things. Where is the West in this? Because they seem very silent. Right. And I hate the fact that I have to ask that question because we can't seem to do it for ourselves. And then the second question I have to what you just said is how do you turn people who are so dependent and enslaved economically by the ANC to have another vision? Because that's what we're requiring in a democratic country, right? We're requiring a whole bunch of voters, right, to see the bigger picture. Now, it's hard for me to see the bigger picture with 3 meals in my body every day and a roof over my head and the internet and access to Google and even before this podcast, I mean, I found myself going down a rabbit hole and in fact didn't even know what I was coming to talk here about anymore because it's so complicated. You don't really know where to begin and where to stop. I guess so. My second question would be, I mean, it's a lot of millions of people that we need to awaken, you know, and the Chinese at this point seem to be winning the disawakening, not that that's a word, but they seem to be combating that awakening. So it's if a person like myself can't even get access to a defined money that we owe them, what are the what are the chances? And that's why I brought in the original question about the West, right? Is because in as much as I truly love this country and as much as I'm truly patriotic about this country and as much as I dream that South Africa would stand up and take ownership for itself, I don't necessarily see that happening because of the socialist dependency, the social system that's, that the country is dependent on, that the majority of the country is dependent on. I mean, for the majority of the country to vote against this is an extraordinary ask.
Well, yeah, but I think if one looks at the numbers, Orrock, you will be kind of surprised.
Fantastic.
Let me just first answer your first question on the situation in the West. And this is the irony of the situation. You've got the US, who is kind of like the bastion of capitalism and democracy, and with a weak leader, in many regards considered, and America's economy is waning. It's not doing good. You've got the Europe also a bit divided, division on the Ukraine-Russian thing, and the French president recently said that they must become less dependent on the US, and you've got the Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum saying that, listen, maybe the Chinese model is something that the rest of the world needs. So it's a kind of a mixed, situation. It's not like the West is like standing together, everybody's united against this whole onslaught by the East, which is really concerning. For me, that is danger signals, red lights. We need to get our ducks in a row and realize, we can't align with the Chinese interests.
Again, there's 2 possible reasons for that, right, as to why that happened. First was the 2008 crisis, right? And especially in relation to China and Africa. I mean, that was their first big access point, right? Is because Western funding literally dried up, right? I mean, so they took advantage of 2008, 2009 for massive investments into the developing world, right? They really took that gap. The second gap that they took was with COVID, right? Now, it's debatable as to who created the COVID, but it would kind of make sense in this line of thought, right, that then a major second boom took place, right, with China and Africa, right? Could those two things, maybe answering my own question, the 2008 crisis and COVID is what weakened the West in terms of its ability to invest in Africa and specifically South Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. It weakened them. And also it was the times of exponential growth in China's economy. China really exploded onto the scene since the 2000s. So ever since then, China has been growing in economic power, military power, political power, all of that. So I think Africa is just part of China's expansion vision. And now that the West is not coming to the table with Africa, the Africans are just so glad to, or African leaders, not people, are so glad to align with China. So I think all of these things kind of played into the hands of the Chinese, and now you've got this Russian-Ukraine war, and Russia and China is backing each other up. So it brings a realignment, and then the whole dollar as a reserve currency in the East. So all of that played into it, but I think it's almost as if it's exactly the time where we need to rethink our we, as you said in the beginning, we can't keep on being either dependent on just the West or the East. Where do we find ourselves? And this is to answer your second question about, is there hope for change politically? Now, if you take into consideration 2019, the ANC got 53% of the votes with just over 10 million people. And there were 19 million people, registered voters, who did not vote.
Yeah.
So it's not as if you need to awaken the masses.
They already know.
Many of the ANC supporters will not vote for the ANC. I can promise you that. Not that they might vote for any other party, but they're simply not going to vote. Even the other parties, I expect them in the 2024 election, all of them to lose votes because, they're not building the trust that they should in trying times. So the two key factors is those that were not voting, they want an alternative. So an alternative is needed. That's not just another political party or just another, it needs to be an initiative that starts speaking a new language, casts vision for a changed South Africa. And then the other factor is the youth. Many of the youth are not voting, and they are not interested in the politics of the day. Some might say, the EFF is attracting attention, but it's not. Many are realizing there's even a couple of youth leaders becoming well-known, criticizing Julius Malema and all of that. So everybody is kind of waiting for the alternative, and I think that's the key in the times to come. That an alternative needs to get onto the scene, and I think it's very possible that it could. The people are so ready. The people are so ready. I mean, the more every lockdown, not lockdown, load shedding happens, it's almost as if, a credible alternative just needs to raise its head. And there might be a massive surprise in the 2024 election.
Not to repeat myself again, but it seems that we are the problem, not China or the West. Or it's the second time we're doing this to ourselves, or the third time we're doing this to ourselves, right? I mean, we got involved in an ideological struggle in the 70s and the 80s. Right, we send our youth to go and fight and get murdered in Angola for a war that meant nothing at the end of the day. It's another Ukraine, basically, is what was happening in Angola at the time, just a smaller version. I mean, basically funded by the same parties who are funding the situation right now. And now, for the second time, we're now getting into an ideological East-West sort of situation. And as a country, we've adopted a Western democracy as our constitution and as our rule of law, but yet our leaders seem to be Eastern based and socialist, and I can't understand if they are in fact legitimate socialists or whether corruption just makes them socialist. Why adopt a first Western democracy as a government if you're going to be socialist? Surely you should have just then gone socialist to begin with.
It's a good point. I think to get the let's say the global support. I mean, at that stage, early 1990s, I mean, China wasn't the force that it is today. The Russians were at the Cold War, drawing the short end of the stick. So the power base was definitely in the West, and for us to become favorable or seen favorably by the rest of the world, we need to put a democratic system in place. And I think that was the thing that kind of mixed it all up. We had political leaders and parties, ANC and so on, were socially totally socialist, but now we had the power of the West. So I think again we tried to take two hands, and now it's pulling us apart, and we don't realize what we're actually doing. And the momentum globally is also shifting. So I think it's just more clearer now. One can see more the difference between the two worlds. But I think, in the hearts of the leaders, I don't know, maybe not Nelson Mandela fully. I think he embraced not quite a socialist approach. He was Western in his thinking, but, in terms of the ideological frameworks and backgrounds of the ANC, I mean, for them, it's always been socialist. So I don't know if the thinking was, and this is speculation, that democracy, capitalism, all the stuff of the West are just instruments in order to establish a socialist system. Those could be, because that's what the Chinese did. I mean, they have a supposed mixed economy, but they use all of the capitalist aspects of the economy and so on in order to strengthen their socialist base.
Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered, for the listeners, I'm satisfied anyways myself, the picture where we were at. And I think at this point I'd like to sort of just, firstly I'd like to say I think you're very brave for having written that book, especially in the time that you've written that book. And it must open you up to a lot of criticism. I mean, the greedy capitalist is not going to like this idea.
Well,
and if I can use a personal example before we proceed, and this is where I find your book rather fascinating, right? So I recently took over a family farm.
Okay.
I don't want to be specific, obviously, on the location. And long story short, there's a black family that's been working on the farm for a long time. They're part of my ancestry, or not my ancestry, but our ancestors obviously have been together for 150 years. And moving back to the farm, I suggested to my family that perhaps it would be time that this farm became an inclusive economy. And that the only way forward is going to be to share more, right? Because the way in which we're going now and the disparity that we're operating under now, to me, is a very obvious conflict zone, right? So for me, trying to be sustainable, trying to have children into the future in this country, I'm interested in sustainable relations. And in that way, I can only see inclusivity happening in that. Now, the kickback that I got from not only my family, but the community as a whole is quite astonishing. How unready we are for this discussion. And this is what I mean. Great respect to you for writing this book, because just in my own small little way, I try to implement something like that, something that you're suggesting that we need to implement on a macro level. I tried on a very insignificant level, and I'm not getting it right. So before we go there, perhaps if we can, just for everyone, just a brief description. I mean, inclusive economics pretty much says it all, but I mean, if you can just lay it out for us in a simple
Yeah. Thanks, Orrock. I'd love to then delve also into that aspect of why it's not easy to accept. But on the other hand, it's inevitable.
Exactly.
We have to go that direction.
Absolutely.
But the concept of inclusive economics or an inclusive economy, is something that I put together. The concept has been there, but how I put it together in the book as well, and then the whole framework in terms of how to implement it is very much centered on economy driven by inclusive growth. Now, inclusive growth is different than just the GDP growth that we are used to.
I found that a very interesting point in your book. It's the main point.
It's the main point, inclusive growth, and we can delve into that as well. But and then through inclusive growth, making sure there is genuine economic progress. So in other words, not just progress where there's more money in the pockets, but where quality of life improves, where the well-being of the people improves, both in terms of quality of life and also the planet. So a more sustainable economy. And it's almost as if, and I think just speaking to your to the issue that you're dealing with, because many other communities are dealing with the same thing. We all realize something needs to change, but we don't have a good example of where it has been successful or where it has worked well and where it has generated benefits for everybody.
There's been too many forces undoing that.
Exactly. Yeah. And we default to a thinking of, no, this sounds like socialism.
Exactly.
And this is what I'm trying to do in the book. So I'm trying to take the best of capitalism, because the thing is, the best system is a market-based system. It's definitely not a centrally planned, centrally controlled system. That's not the best, because you're putting hands in the power of a few. So we need the market-based system driven by competition and market factors. But the thing is, how you generate growth, and this is where inclusive growth comes in, is you need to create entry points in that process for those who were formerly excluded. So that they are included, but not just for the sake of inclusion. We're talking about productive inclusion.
Exactly.
So the moment the mindset shifts from, listen, more can benefit, to listen, more can contribute, and everybody can benefit more, and doing so productively, that's a win-win scenario. And I think that's the shift that needs to take place in terms of our thinking. And then also, so it's taking the best, and this is the inclusive economy, the best of capitalism, and chucking away the issues of inequality, poverty, unemployment, dealing with those. And then on the other hand, not taking the best of socialism, because socialism as a system is central control of resources, and that's not what we want. We actually want a decentralized economy, so that we can empower local communities. But as I say to my students as well, there's something, there's communism, but then there's communalism. And actually,
which is Africanism.
It's very much Africanism. Yeah. That's why in the title of the book there's Ubuntu.
Exactly.
Ubuntu is a powerful concept. Now, I know it's been politicized a lot, and there's a lot of stuff said. But in essence, it is communalism. It is looking after everybody in the community. Absolutely. I can't sleep if my neighbor is hungry. That whole principles, and this is the principles that capitalism needs as a system.
Well, this is what Africa was before capitalism.
Exactly. Yeah. But we've in a sense lost it, because we've become profit driven, but then also the corruption
we've also become
element.
Consumers, like everyone else in the world.
Consumers, yes. Yeah. And then also, we've lost our ability to steward resources properly because of the short-term gains. So it's almost rediscovering our origins, combining it with a market-based system, and making sure it's decentralized. Decentralized so that it can't be controlled by external forces. Not the Chinese, not the whatever elite or those in power or the bank banking or the this or the that, because this is important, because this is how you empower local communities so they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, but there needs to be collaboration. And I think this is what the inclusive economy facilitates or enables, more community level collaboration. And I think once the value of this has been discovered, we will never look back. A unique African model will come to the fore, and this will become a solution to the weaknesses of capitalism in the West, and also a counter against the socialism of the East.
Just a complete side note on your book when I was reading it. The sort of the weakness that I saw there was governance, right? Because that requires people, right? And people want things, you know, and people feel powerful when they have positions of apparent power over other people. And kind of that's where we're stuck in the world right now, you know. It's a bunch of people making decisions for us. Now, I mean, I know that this is really forward thinking, but wouldn't it be possible within that model to put an AI system of government in that didn't require that human interface, where we could all vote on a topic on an app, for example, and that was fed through a mainstream decision-making software, which then came up with an unemotive decision that
represents the views of the people.
I guess what I'm trying to say is African culture, yes, it had its individual leaders, but it was very consultative.
Yes.
You know, and even today, I mean, I spent many years in the mining industry before my current attempting to be a farmer, but that's why public participation is so pushed in this country. It's not pushed, it's a requirement within the culture, where that is narrated out properly and taken its time to do as such. Anyway, I just find it an interesting point that perhaps the government itself, the institution of government, is the actual weakness to the inclusive economy.
Absolutely. I actually explain that in the book as well. The concept I'm promoting in terms of government is also called inclusive government, which means that people don't decide for the leaders, the people decide.
Exactly.
How does the people decide?
Yeah.
So what you need to do, yes, of course, AI could help, and technology and all this could speed up the process, but actually the solution is not in the mechanism. The solution is in the people being in their interests being included in the decision making, and them having a voice, and the leaders respond to the people. So in 2020 there was a constitutional court case that said the Voting Act must change to include independent candidates, so that the voting system is different, because at the moment it's only political parties. They've got the control. The people can't hold parties or leaders accountable. They vote for them at elections, etc. So the system as a democracy is actually not working in terms of accountability. But the moment you move towards independent candidates and independence, you can have small constituents. Actually, the Van Zyl-Slabbert report that was tabled in Parliament in the early 2000s suggested that the country needs to be divided up into 69 constituencies, where each constituency identifies 7 or 8 leaders to present them in Parliament and also in the executive. And through that, they are direct representation.
Gotcha.
And that's the key.
A proper democracy.
Proper democracy, where the people's voices are heard, and also where the people can replace a leader before the elections when they are not happy with that leader. And that's a way to prevent against corruption, and to have more accountability.
I mean, I remember it was very effective. My father was a member of Parliament for the Nationalist Party. I'm not trying to boost him in any way, but it was a regional elective. And if he came home to the farm road that was in a mess, his neighbours were lined up at the farm, and they weren't shy about expressing the emotions of the state of the road. And it became very clear that if he wanted to keep his job, he'd need to fix this road.
Exactly.
And we don't really have that link. Anyway, I think if we can work our way toward a conclusion, instead of focusing on the book as a principle or an ideology, perhaps my question would be to you is, in 5 or 10 steps. They can be as radical as you would like. How do we take that book and make it a reality? Let's just say we're having a utopian conversation.
Yeah.
And you can achieve anything you want, right? How would you do it?
Very good. Of course, in the book, there's a number of focus areas and components of this inclusive economy. But I would take it right down to the community level and say, listen, let's first look at the principles of inclusivity, and that I outline in the book, and let's repurpose this local economy. Repurposing means that we make a few decisions. Nobody must be hungry anymore from this day forward. So what's needed for that? Let's put in this community distribution systems, food distribution systems in place. Then we say, listen, let's look at the value chain of businesses. Can we turn, let's say, rubbish into gold? Gotcha. We've got a lot of problems with plastic and stuff lying around.
So focusing on each specific area, like you mentioned, with the 69 constituencies, and making each area as profitable and as intensive as possible.
Exactly. And sharing, not about sharing the profit, but there's a instead of a shareholding approach, you can have a stakeholding approach. You want people to be proud of their businesses in their community, not as owners, but as members of a community.
Absolutely.
You want to build that culture, but the only way to do that is for businesses to include the community more in terms of the benefits derived from that business. It doesn't mean profit sharing now and shareholding and all kinds of. We jump towards inclusion doesn't mean everybody must now share in my benefits, whatever. Inclusion is a process, and it's actually a mindset change. For instance, let me give you an example. What we currently have is a social contract, and it comes from the Enlightenment age, where we pay taxes, the government provides service, and there's a kind of an agreement, gentleman's agreement. But that social contract is broken.
It's not working so well for us.
Yeah, because trust is lost.
Absolutely.
So what I propose in the book is that we have a social covenant. Now, I know it might be a weird word for some, but a covenant is a stronger commitment than a contract. Contract means you do your part, I'll do mine. If we don't, we take each other to court. A covenant means we have shared values. We have shared principles, and there's a certain way of doing things in this community. And I will help you do yours, you will help me do mine, and we it's more community oriented.
How do we begin that?
Yeah.
Like, so, how do we? And I'm sorry to be so negative about my own country, but societally we're rotten.
Yeah.
Well, we are, and you mentioned very important points in your book that I really enjoyed, like moral economics and spiritual economics.
Moral regeneration.
Isn't that really the core issue that we're sitting with in this country, right?
It's part of the core, absolutely.
You talk to these localized centralizations. You talk to family units again playing a very important role.
Absolutely.
Anybody who follows me would know that I'm a huge promoter of the family unit, and we don't have that anymore. We've got the highest rate of fatherlessness in the world.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's why I keep going back to what you're suggesting is massive, because it's going to take redefining the spirituality of this country.
Yeah. The moral fiber.
The moral fiber of this country, right? And not to quote the Chinese or to bring the Chinese back into this, but they seem to be doing it quite well. With their cultural offices and their media.
For the wrong purpose.
The wrong purpose.
But they are doing it well.
They are doing it well. And we seem very behind the game in this, right? And I just wonder, it's again a fantastic concept, but how do you spiritually awaken a country? Is it a leader? Are we needing a Nelson Mandela? Or is it something that we ourselves are going to have to promote, for example, like in this podcast, or talk more about, or
Orrock, I mean, I think it would be incredible if leaders were to arise and promoting these kind of thinking, and I think that will be part of it. But more so, it will be communities taking responsibilities for themselves. You know, we now have taxpayers associations. We already have initiatives in that direction. Civil society organizations getting involved, fixing the potholes. So there's a sense of that taking shape. Now it just needs to go to the next level where we say, listen, we as a community now fully take responsibility. We draw all stakeholders around the table, and this is the power of a social covenant, that you get everybody around the table: the security, the business community, the schools, the normal civil society, all the different groups, and say, listen, let's agree on this set of values. Let's agree on how this community will be managed. You know, why I'm emphasizing that.
So in short, it's up to us.
It's up to us, but good news is it's already happening. There are communities, I think Howick is a classic example of how some of these things are already starting.
Hartbeespoort.
Yeah, Hartbeespoort. Senekal is another example. So, and even in Pretoria, Doornkloof, I think there's already, and many others. Cape Town, Wellington is an example. So there's a real willingness, I think in Franschhoek as well, there was a whole a community collaborating during COVID or whatever, the lockdown. But there's a sense of community collaboration. And to be honest, why I'm punting that so much is because more than fixing the systems in South Africa, the nation needs healing.
Absolutely.
It's bleeding. It's from the past, the current situation.
Absolutely.
And it's only when the community come together that, the healing can start setting in. Now, when that starts happening, and I'm not saying as a precondition, I mean, there can be change tomorrow at national level and then new policies being implemented, corruption. I mean, this is not a either or. It's but I see it as a bottoms-up approach, a governance from below, and then that filters up and then increasingly hold government to account. And then out of that, people can put in place the change at the top that's needed. So it's a gradual process, but I think, what the book, and I don't see it as just a ideological. It's a practical framework to rethink the economy, to repurpose the economy. Repurpose, that word is important. Even repurposing business. Is it just about myself, my profit, what I can gain, or is it about my community? And I think that's the repurposing that's needed in the current state. And to be honest, that's what's going to make Africa thrive. Why? Because it's a more collectivistic mindset, whereas the West is more individualistic, and the East, you've got a socialist. So it can be that perfect balance that Africa needs. And I think the moment, especially the youth get involved, because remember, part of this, if a community takes ownership and we say no more hunger, and we stop hunger, we put distribution systems in place, farmers come to the party, we start food gardens, practical stuff, then we say, okay, the young people, let's identify them, we're going to do some skills development. If we can't train them, we get training in. And then for me, I see a cross-pollination between communities where we start sharing skills, and those young people start their own small businesses. Look, the Muslims are doing it. Spaza shops in the communities, they build a network, they build an economy within an economy. Why can't the rest of the country do the same?
You're basically talking about literally establishing Israel without the extreme capitalism.
Yeah. To a large extent.
To a large extent, what they did, right?
Yeah.
Their kibbutz-style farming.
Yes.
The way each towns were developed and centralized. Each town's got a legitimate doctor, business.
Yeah.
You know,
a self-sustainable community.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the thinking. And there are a number of farmers now thinking in this direction as well around the country.
They take a lot of resistance, I can tell you from personal experience.
Absolutely. But there are people who can assist with this, who's experienced in building this. this. So I think it's going to take shape in different forms. But the key thing is it must draw communities together. The people, if that factor can kick in, South Africa will change and we will become less dependent on the rest of the world. I mean, we're sitting on the richest continent in the world.
Absolutely.
We have not unlocked it economically. And I mean, in 94, we answered the political question, but we have not answered the economic question. There's so much potential here, and we should stop looking at the rest of the world and them to help us while, the answers are amongst us.
Say now we go along this process, right, and we become self-sufficient and we start manufacturing more and we start becoming more powerful, basically, right? How are the greater forces of the world going to respond to us becoming more powerful?
Yeah,
I mean, surely they like us where we are. They get a great raw material at a cheap price. We don't refine it. We're not interested in it. We can even corrupt somebody at the harbor just to sort of shift it out or whatever the case may be. I mean, it suits the West and the East at this point, the way in which we go about our business, right? I mean, this is what Trump ran into trouble with the Democrats over his restrictions on China, right? I mean, this is in essence what he was talking about. He was saying, actually bugger this, we can manufacture stuff ourselves. And he could say that because he was America and Donald Trump.
That's right.
Little South Africa gets up and says no. And then the second question attached to that is bringing you back to the time constraint that we find ourselves under when you said that China is in a rush.
Yes, that's right.
So maybe we don't quite have as much time as we think we do.
Hope for, yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good question. Look, I think it suits everybody in a sense that Africa is weak. And that they could, kind of dominate and extract what they want from Africa. The thing is just, it's also in their benefit if Africa grows and Africa becomes even a powerhouse, but a stronger force internationally.
But to your point again, they like to sell the GDP growth, but not the real growth, right?
The genuine progress.
Yeah, so their interpretation of our growth is GDP based, right? So that's how they punt us. They go, well, Zambia's growing at 7%. But the actual, as you explain in your book, the trickle down effect
that's right.
of that GDP 7% growth is not in fact real growth.
No. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if you measure it in terms of living standards, it's not the same. But the thing is, when it would be in the interest of the West if we become stronger, because then we become less dependent on the East. So in that sense, strategically, it would benefit them. Yes, it's going to mean a bit more competition, and but also our dependence on the West would decrease, on the World Bank and all of it, for economic development, because our people will become more developed. For the East, it's more of a concern because they want to include us into BRICS and with all these other new nations joining in, Iran, Turkey, and Argentina, and all of that creates a situation where they can't manipulate us and Africa as they would want to. For me, that's the biggest benefit. But even in terms of us, growing, and creating our own jobs, our dependency even on the East would decrease. So in terms of geopolitical repositioning, I think it would be in some sense in the favor of both. But what would not be is if we become a real powerhouse, if Africa rise to its fullest and become a dominating force, because that would upset both sides. But that's exactly what is needed. I want to say, unless Africa gets into that position, we're going to remain in this dependency.
Just to summarize, there was an interesting quote that you used in the beginning of your book that pretty much, and I just want to bring, it's the time issue that is of concern to me, where you quoted somebody where they basically said that we have two choices, either a environmental disaster, right, mass starvation, or global catastrophe as in war, right? I mean, that's a pretty serious intro to the book, right? Which underscores the rush.
Yes.
Right. The other interesting part that I saw in the book is that South Africa, in order for the first world to convince us that we need to develop to the level of the first world, we'd use 672% of all the Earth's resources, which is 7 times more than what we have. So in other words, what they're telling us we can't achieve anyway.
Yeah. That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the only choice we've got as South Africans, according to you right now, as Africans, according to economics or a theory anyway, is we either do this by ourselves or we buggered.
Yeah, it's very extreme. And my point with that was just to say there are some serious realities, and we need to be part of finding the solutions here. But the other thing is, and with that percentage of over 600%, is the fact that if we follow the same trajectory, the same kind of growth, the same methods of how the first world grew and all the other countries, then we're not going to make it. So we need to find our own way. So that's why I'm emphasizing inclusive growth, because inclusive growth has a exponential growth effect. It's not just as if more people are benefiting from growth, it's more people are contributing, and the more people are contributing, it has an exponential contribution effect.
Understood.
So you literally flip that formula around, and actually we get faster out of the trouble situation, and that's when we empower our own people more. So I wouldn't say we're buggered. I'm just we have no other option, like Ronald Reagan, Tina. There is no alternative than to start getting our own house in order, getting our own economic policies in place.
How much time do you think we have?
Well,
I just draw just a general.
I would say we are in the year 2023 now. I would say maximum 10 years.
Maximum 10 years.
7 years is a more fair estimate, but I would say if we don't get our ducks in a row within the next 7 years.
So the fear and the urgency that I feel as a normal South African, you can see quantified through economics.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Because I'm a layman, so obviously I don't see what you see. I'm not at the think tanks at the IMF. I'm not exposed to this. But my gut instinct tells me that there's a significant urgency.
There is. And this is where the whole governance issue becomes so important, because, for instance, energy. We have an energy crisis, but that energy crisis can be turned overnight if we start moving towards and if we privatize the energy sector, for instance, it can become a mass opportunity of growth.
But then China doesn't get the coal.
Yes. But you see, just chuck the government out, replace them.
Exactly.
Overnight this can set in, so it feels so far, but
we're their fourth biggest producer, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So they're not going to let that go. They're not going to go, have a party, enjoy, and we'll go and buy from someone else.
But fortunately, we have a democracy. Yeah. Fortunately, we can, with one election, outvote them. We can literally change it overnight. And Orrock, that's the big lever in our hands, and that's why we can talk about the economy, and this is a very important discussion. But unless the people wake up and bring the change in 2024, we're not going to see real change. We are digging ourselves deeper into the hole while we are at the cusp of changing systems. The political system can be changed. The economic system can be changed.
The great reset is happening. Let's reset with it.
Let's take it in the right direction. The energy crisis, all of these crises, the corruption presents opportunities for growth, turning it around. If you just stop corruption in South Africa, we will have so much money that we generate growth. We develop our own skills. Young people are so ready to become more productive in the nation. So there can be a quick change if we have intervention in 2024. But I think even without that intervention, if we can get ourselves organized at community level, we can rebuild. Just like, we can rebuild the walls. We can restore the ruined places. If communities start taking ownership and realize that our, state is not dependent on what the government is doing. And I think that's key. For me, that communities taking responsibility is what will heal South Africa. It has mass potential for people to come in together, black, white, colored, across the board, and say, listen, let's start building. It's our community. Let's become proud of this. And those two factors, the people awakening, for me, is what will get Africa to rise up.
Dr. Niekerk, thanks for coming on to the first ever Orrock podcast. That was really cool. It actually went a whole lot better than I expected. That was really awesome. And I just want to thank you for putting your step forward for the country in terms of your book. Again, I'm sure many will disagree with it. Many will be negative about the possibility of it. But unless there are people out there willing to suggest a different way, there never will be. So I thank you so much for the book, and to South Africans out there, have a read of it. It really is an awesome concept in terms of how we could possibly change the country around. Thanks a lot. Cheers, Arno.
Thank you. Thanks, Orrock.
Perfect.